Hi everyone. So I've had quite a few requests recently for more information around running conditioning, running profiles, how to develop fitness for field hockey. And I've done a few posts recently which have been well received. So I wanted to go into a little bit more depth in this video on some of these topics. But if you do like this video and you find it engaging, enjoyable, informative, please subscribe to the channel and share with anyone you think would find it useful. So first of all, these are the three kind of key areas we're going to look at. One is maximal aerobic speed, one is anaerobic speed reserve, and the other is repeat sprint ability. So we'll be going into kind of a bit of definitions around these three, just kind of get a bit of clarity, because a lot of these words can be thrown around, and it's important that we define what we really mean by these and how they can be useful to inform training prescription and to understand someone's running profile. So to begin with, the main advantages of developing someone's running profile is that you can individualize training, first and foremost. You're not just following a generic running conditioning program. Secondly, that you can monitor progress more accurately, because if you, between point A and point B and two testing points, you can actually refer to specific values on an individual level, then you can more accurately prescribe, monitor, and track progress. And then thirdly, it ensures that you're providing appropriate training volumes and loads for the individual, and you're not just giving people the same kind of volumes irrespective of their level of conditioning. It's important that if someone's running profile is quite poor, that obviously the volumes and intensities are lower than if someone is a lot more advanced. This is a simple visual I've put together just to kind of explain some of these terms. You can sort of see them and what they really mean. So if you imagine someone's running profile looking like this, with the very top of this kind of tube, if you like, of speed at 100% of someone's capability of running speed, that is our maximum sprint speed. Slightly lower down then at around 70%. That's an arbitrary number. It depends very much on the individual, and that's why the profile's important. That's where we get our maximal aerobic speed, and this is the speed at which VO2 max occurs, or the lowest speed at which VO2 max occurs. A good indicator of someone's aerobic fitness, and can be a pretty important measure to determine someone's performance readiness, how effective they're going to be, how conditioned they are. The anaerobic speed reserve then, which is quite an important consideration, is the difference between these two things. So if someone's maximal sprint speed is very high relative to their maximal aerobic speed, then the anaerobic speed reserve is going to be very large, which means that they've got a large reserve to call upon. However, it's also important that someone's maximal aerobic speed is high as well. So you'd probably see most extreme example of this in a 100-meter sprinter, where their max sprint speed is going to be very high relative to their maximum aerobic speed. So their anaerobic speed reserve will be very large. Whereas an endurance athlete is probably going to have an incredibly high maximal aerobic speed relative to their maximum sprint speed. So their anaerobic speed reserve will be slightly smaller. In a hybrid sport like hockey, you probably need to have something in the middle. We need to have a well-optimized maximal aerobic speed and also a well-optimized maximal sprint speed, because the higher the sprint speed, the higher the ceiling, the lower our sub-maximal intensities become relative to the individual. So if we can take someone's max sprint speed from 7 meters per second to 8 meters per second, everything at 5 meters per second now feels a whole lot easier. We've become more economical in our sprinting and our movement, and we've become more conditioned because of that. Equally, if we can increase our maximal aerobic speed through conditioning work, as also as a byproduct of increasing sprint speed, we will become more able to perform high intensity actions and recover fast between them. So that's a quick overview of the differences between those three terminologies. And you could also compare two different athletes using this approach, or a whole squad of athletes, if you have the capability to do so, to look at the differences between the two. And this gives us important information, because if two athletes have very different profiles, we can start to give them a little bit more of an individualized approach. Okay, the first thing to establish is our maximal aerobic speed. And we can do this through a 16 pitch length test. Super simple. The gold standard would be the 30-15, but not everyone has access to capability to get that done in terms of the setup, the recording, and the kind of logistics involved. So it's simpler for most people to perform a very simple time trial test like this. Can use a 10 pitch length test. However, progressively, I think a 16 pitch length is probably a little bit more appropriate and physiologically a better determinant of our maximal aerobic speed because of the distance and time involved. So very simply, you need to run 16 pitch lengths, which is 1,462 meters or 1,600 yards, as quick as possible. Now, it's important that this is a sustainable speed because it's our maximal aerobic speed. If we go out very, very fast, then it's likely we're going to hit a wall quite quickly. So we need to ensure that the speed we're running at is pretty sustainable. If, for example, this athlete we've made up here could run 16 pitch lengths in 5 minutes and 30 seconds, that gives 330 seconds. So the distance there would be that should obviously say 1462, not 1500 on the bottom there, but 1462 divided by 330 would give us 4.43 meters per second. And that would therefore be our maximal aerobic speed. So we can now establish, that's the first number we now know, and we can compare that between people. We can compare that between, between different time points. So if we test someone in 3 months later, we can compare if that speed's gone up, down, has it remained largely the same? And we can also compare it against normative values, for example, against like world-class data from different sports. And if someone were to achieve 4.43, that would be a good maximum aerobic speed by most definitions. That would be pretty quick. When it comes to prescribing it for intervals next, because what we don't do then is just run at that speed. We run either below it or above it, dependent on what the outcome is we're trying to achieve. Normally, through maximal aerobic intervals, we're trying to work above maximal aerobic speed to try and challenge that aerobic system to work at a higher work rate effectively. So if we were going to work for 30 seconds at intervals, we're probably looking in the ballpark of 105%, so 5% extra in speed. If it's 20 seconds, it would be 10% higher, 15 seconds, 15%, and 10 seconds, 20%. It doesn't have to be exactly that, but these are kind of ballpark ideas to give you a rough guide for the kind of speeds we should be looking to hit. So if we know we've got 4.43 at 100%, we can take that number and then either scale up or scale down, dependent on the distances we're looking to run at in successive intervals. So here's an example. If we had an interval session, which was 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off, which is kind of a bit of a classic mass interval session, we would take 100% of our mass score, which would be 4.43. If we're going to work for 15 seconds, we would work at 115% of max aerobic speed, which would give you 5.09. And then all you do is you take 15 seconds, multiply by 5.09, and we get an individual target for the athlete of 76 meters. So if we're doing 15 on, 15 off, this individual would need to hit 76 meters, which is, for the sake of simplicity, we'll call it 3/4 of a pitch length. It's slightly more than that, but around that ballpark in the 15-second period before resting for 15 seconds and repeating again. So we could do, on the left-hand side there, 8 repetitions of this. So 15 on, so run 15 seconds, achieve 76 meters, rest 15, run back the opposite direction, do the same, and continue to do that for the repetitions before resting for 3 minutes and then hitting the next block of work for 3 sets in total. Another sort of method we can use is tempo intervals or tempo conditioning. This differs a little bit from mass conditioning in that we're not prescribing from maximal aerobic speed, we're prescribing from maximal running speed or maximal sprint speed. What this means is we're actually going to be running a little faster than we will in mass intervals typically, apart from the top end, but with much more recovery in between. So actually we maintain the quality of the repetitions. Typically what we're looking to do here is run at around 70% of a maximal sprint speed. So we take the fastest possible speed we can achieve over a set distance. So for example, if we could run a pitch length in 11 seconds, this would give us 8.3 meters per second as a speed, which would be good, depending on the level of athlete you're talking about. 70% of this then would give us 5.81 meters per second. And then we could run that same distance with our target time in mind. So we would take the same distance, divide it by our corrected score 5.81, and this person we're trying to achieve that distance down 15.7 seconds over the distance per rep. So the athlete would run the pitch length in 15.7 seconds, thereabout, could be 16, but as long as it's that kind of ballpark, walk for 50 to 60 seconds, normally walking a width or just walking back and forth, but a width works well because you can create a grid system, and then run back the opposite direction to the other end of the pitch in the same target time. And we're going to repeat this typically for anywhere between 4 to 8 repetitions at a time, before again resting for 3 minutes between blocks. At the higher level, you're probably looking at something like 3 sets of 8 repetitions of this kind of work, because it's a lot of high speed running, so it's actually quite taxing on the body, but it's relatively low intensity, which means that we can actually achieve good amounts of volume in this without it affecting other forms of training. So we can still do lots of speed work, and this won't necessarily have a big negative impact on it. Whereas some of the higher intensity mass work, because of the short rest periods, can be neuromuscularly very tiring and can impact on our ability to get good quality speed work in. So this works really well alongside a speed focus. Mass-based intervals work quite well as a standalone focus in of itself. It just depends on what you're trying to achieve. But in effect, tempo intervals sit in that anaerobic speed reserve window, just like high intensity mass intervals do, but differ slightly in the sense that it's more about quality of the speed work than it is about the intensity. So then when we talk about, and we showed in that slide earlier on, but anaerobic speed reserve, it's the difference between our max running speed and our maximal aerobic speed. Okay, so if we can work out our max running speed, and we've also worked out our maximal aerobic speed, we know then what the anaerobic speed reserve is, and we can actually prescribe from this too. So we can prescribe from 3 different things. We can prescribe purely from our top speed, which is what's called tempo intervals. We can prescribe from our mass intervals or maximal aerobic speed, and therefore prescribe intervals off the back of it. Or we can prescribe using our anaerobic speed reserve as a percentage of that difference between mass and max sprint speed. So if there's a difference of 3.5 meters per second between maximal aerobic speed and max sprint speed, we could take, say, 10 to 20% of that distance and prescribe in that sort of zone as well. So I'll show you how to do that now. So if we were now going to do, again, high intensity interval work, this is more similar to mass-based conditioning. It's very similar, just with a little bit more of accuracy of prescription, because we're also incorporating someone's sprint speed into the equation as well now. It could be 10 seconds on, 10 seconds off. And to calculate how far we need to run in this time, first of all, we take our mass score. So we know it's 4.43. And this person's max sprint speed is 8 meters per second. Difference between the two, therefore, is 3.57 meters per second. And we're going to do 20% anaerobic speed reserve intervals, which is if we take 20% of that 3.57, it's 0.89. We then take a mass score of 4.43, add back on 20% of our anaerobic speed reserve, and we've got 5.3 meters per second as our intensity prescription based off of anaerobic speed reserve. Then what we do, that 10-second interval, very simply, 10 seconds at 5.3 meters per second gives us 53 meters as a target distance in that time. A lot of maths, but hopefully that is relatively clear and visual using the sort of pitch there, so you can sort of see how that all fits together. So in summary, with this method, we need to have an accurate idea of our max sprint speed, and this is probably one of the difficulties practically often, is to get a really accurate picture of our max sprint speed can be quite difficult unless we've got things like timing gates or a speed gun. Not everyone does. So for most people, just simply using something like tempo intervals based off of our best effort over a distance, or mass intervals based off of a 16 pitch lengths, is actually quite an easy and effective way of training. But if we're going to truly optimize our running conditioning individualization, then really we should be incorporating max sprint speed too, because that makes it more individual. If we take as a consideration 2 athletes with the same maximal aerobic speed but very different max sprint speeds, actually the conditioning intervals will be a lot more difficult for someone who is slower, because they're having to work at a relatively higher percentage of their anaerobic speed reserve, even if their maximal aerobic speed percentage is the same. So if we want to, depends if we need to optimize or just simply logistically make it work given the context in which we're working. So if we're working in a club setting and we just need to have some simple interval work prescribed, then something like mass intervals is going to be a very effective way of doing it. We can individualize the distance all the time, depending on which way around we want to do it. Or we can use tempo intervals just off of the best distance time across a distance. And that will work fine. If, however, we're trying to really dial into some specifics and really want to make the training prescription accurate, we probably need to include the top speed in the equation as well as maximal aerobic speed too. Okay, last little piece of the puzzle then is what's called repeat sprint ability. And this is a very important characteristic in hockey because the sport in of itself really is a repeat sprint sport. It's a high intensity repeat sprint based task. We often perform a high intensity action and then have a small amount of recovery before we need to do the same thing again. So it's not consistent, same speed running over and over again like mass intervals. It's more similar to this. So if we're talking about specificity, this is now a much more specific measure of our performance characteristics, but they all have a place. And I'll show you in a slide in just a second how I, in my mind, philosophically piece these pieces together. This is almost the final piece of the jigsaw, in my mind at least. You need to have the foundations in place first. So if we've got well-developed mass scores and max sprint speed are in place, we can then begin to worry about our repeat sprint ability as well. A simple test to measure this, you probably need, ideally, you have to make this as accurate as possible. You need to use running gaits, timing gaits. However, if you don't, you can use a stopwatch, but bear in mind it's going to be pretty wildly inaccurate if you do that. You could also measure distance and have a set time instead, which could work. But ideally, in a gold standard, you need to have timing gaits to do this. For the test, you can do a 20-meter shuttle, so out and back 20 meters, with a 1 meter lead in. So you start 1 meter back from the start line where the timing gates are. Sprint out to 20 meters and back as fast as possible. And these are performed on a 30-second rolling clock. So you start on 0, sprint out and back as fast as you can. As soon as you cross the line, you've got the remainder of that 30-second window to recover before going again. So if it takes you 7 seconds to go out and back, you've got 23 seconds to recover before you go again. If it takes you 8 seconds, you've got 22, and so on. You're going to perform between 6 to 8 repetitions. Depends whether you want to do slightly higher rep numbers or slightly lower, but effectively either's fine. And we're going to continue to do that until the 8 repetitions are over. Record the time for every single interval. And the 3 things we're interested in are the initial sprint time, so how fast you can complete super fresh your first interval, which is a measure of your max intensity you're capable of. Our total sprint time, so the cumulative time of all 8, we'll call it, repetitions. And then lastly, the fatigue index, which is the difference in percentage between our best and our worst scores, okay? Which is a percentage drop off in speed. What this then gives us is this, which is a kind of what I would typically use as a quadrant system, which is has the athlete got what's their initial sprint speed like, and what's their total time like? Are they fast and fast? Are they slow and slow? Or are they a combination of the two? So if an athlete at the bottom left they've got a really slow initial time, they're just slow, and their total time is also pretty slow, they just need to focus on speed, because you could do as much conditioning work as you like, but that's always going to be limited by their ability to move quickly. As repeat sprint ability is, the fastest athletes typically are the best performers in repeat sprint ability because they're working at a relative lower percentage, again, of their top speed. This is why it's so important to be fast. On the top right, then, we've got an athlete who's got a great initial time and a really good overall time. What we can do with this kind of athlete is actually become a lot more focused on the positional specific, what we call game speed demands, which would be things like what kind of positions they normally start on start from on the pitch? Are they doing, more of like a curved run, for example, as a forward, as a, fullback? Are we doing a little bit more kind of focus on the kind of more positional specific demands? If you're a screen, position specific. So becoming really focused on the kind of highly specific nature of the movements on the pitch, as opposed to a general base of physical conditioning. If it's the top left, then the athlete's got a quick initial times. They're quick, but their times drop off fast. And that's normally indicative of their ability to buffer what we call lactate buffer intervals. So now enable them to sustain speed without accumulating high amounts of lactate that reduce their ability to sustain that speed. So things like a minute on, 30 seconds off can be a very effective means of, they're really hard intervals, but a really effective way of achieving this. And then bottom right, we've got slow initial time. So they're a slow athlete, but they've got a fast total time, so they can sustain the speed overall. And when I say fast, it's relative to their own individual speed, as opposed to suddenly they've got quick overall. We mean their ability to sustain their speed is good, but their actual sprint speed itself is slow. So they still need to get faster. So that's the importance of top speed in all of these profiles. Finally, in this last slide, then, what we're looking at is a summary of how I philosophically put this all together in my mind, which is that initially the bottom rung of the ladder, if you like, in this pyramid, we need to focus on robustness. And that, from a conditioning standpoint, means focusing in on our aerobic capacity, our work capacity, just being able to sustain work. And so we need to ensure that we're fit enough to cope with running demands of tournaments, training, match demands, successive games in successive days, that kind of thing. So focusing in on our max aerobic speed first, in my mind, is a good place to start, because it gives us a basis of conditioning to absorb and cope with training demands more broadly. Once that's in place, we can begin to really focus on that max velocity. So trying to focus our efforts on max sprint speed. We know that has a big knock-on effect to our repeatability in repeat sprintability. And then finally, we can really focus in on our repeatability. So once we've got really high top speed sorted, we can then start to focus in on some more specifics around the repeatability. Now, this isn't always the case, that it may make more sense logically in some context that we just focus straight away on the repeatability, but we're trying to work through systems. I think in my mind, it's important that we get that robustness piece right first before focusing on intensity, and then moving on to repeatability later. So I hope that's been helpful. I hope that's been a kind of whistle-stop tour of how to build out a running profile. If you've enjoyed this, pop a comment in the bottom. Let me know what you think. And let me know what you'd also like to hear more of.